Well, welcome back into the We Shall Not Sleep podcast. Thank you so much for joining us once again this week. Tremendous opportunity as we celebrate this time of our Christian calendar, which we are talking about Pentecost, which I mentioned on last week's episode. It's very fitting to have on a guest who has a lot of experience in the ministry. But before I get there, I just want to say thank you for the continued support, continued reviews, feedback, likes, etc. Again, we are available on multiple platforms for your convenience. And through your prayers, your support, your suggestions, this podcast continues to grow, reach more people, and continues to talk about things that I think need to be talked about and receive maybe some, I guess, perspective from guests who have the not just professionalism to talk about more difficult things, but they also have the experience and wisdom in those topics. And the guests that I have lined up again are just something that I cannot wait for you guys to hear. And that leads me to tonight's guest. 35 years of ministry. I think for anyone, no matter what tradition you're in, that just begs a listening ear because that's a lot of experience and a lot of wisdom. And that's why I'm so excited for you to hear tonight's guest. Some people call him father, some call him brother. I call him my uncle, who also happens to be a pastor. So please welcome in Dr. Stephen Krebill. Okie dokie. Well, hey, Uncle Steve, thank you so much for joining us this week. What a tremendous gift it has been to be able to coordinate this with you. And for a lot of people that call you many different titles, you've always been my uncle. But to welcome in to the We Shall Not Sleep podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, it's my privilege and honor. And I tell you, as we'll get into a lot of our family history here, it's just so cool to see. Like basically, my first year of ministry is now officially the last year of yours, which we'll talk about. But that's going to be for those who are listening to this. That's going to be one of the bases of these conversations is the shared bond that my uncle Steve and I have had. And the reason why I've asked him on here is to share the fact that he's been in ministry for 35 years. He is retiring this year. How exciting! As one adventure ends, a new one is going to begin. So, particularly for those young people in ministry, or even those who have been experienced, I think that you will find, I think, a lot of good takeaways here. And if I could start, Uncle Steve, where I like to start off with all of my guests, for the benefit of others and sometimes for the benefit of myself, is can you just share like what led you to the church, what led you to Christ, and like how did that start?
Certainly, I would be more than happy to share that with you. And it's a story I've had to tell many times in my lifetime, especially when I was feeling like I was being called to ministry. There's a lot in our structure where you have to sort of tell your call story, which begins, of course, with your story of how you felt called to become a Christian. So, as you know, I come from a family that didn't go to church or have any particular expression of religion or faith in Jesus or anybody else. But as I was thinking about talking with you today, I was remembering one little piece that I haven't always used in this story, and that is I do remember Grandma when I was little using the phrase "the man upstairs" to talk to me about good behavior and what I should be watching, how I acted because the man upstairs was watching. And I couldn't have been more than three or four, I think, probably when she used that. And I remember probably at that young age being a little bit confused by it, because probably at the time that she was telling me there didn't happen to be a man upstairs at the time, because little kids are very literal, and the only man that might be up there would be Grandpa, and he wasn't there at the moment. And then I got to thinking maybe somebody was in the attic, maybe somebody was living in the attic or something. But it didn't take me long before I realized that was, that was like a very preliminary understanding of who God was. Was the sort of man upstairs, and I got the idea that there was some cosmic understanding of upstairs. but my introduction to Jesus actually came in a couple of different, very contrasting ways, that kind of ran on separate but parallel tracks for a while before things sort of changed for me. So the first one was that our neighbors across the street, the Wiltsey family, Don and Alice, and their 5 kids, who were Susan, Teresa, Steve, Mark, and Glenn, belonged to Emmanuel Lutheran Church on the Michigan Avenue, on the corner of Brown and Michigan. I would say across from Westwood Mall, but in the beginning, when I started going there was no Westwood Mall.
Right.
But anyway, they belonged to Emmanuel, and every summer Emmanuel had Vacation Bible School. And every summer from the time that I was 4, we got invited by the Wiltseys to go with us to a Vacation Bible School in Emmanuel. And because I'm a baby boomer, this would have been, probably the first time would have been in 1960. They probably had 125, 150 kids at Vacation Bible School. So that was my first introduction to hearing about Jesus and singing songs about Jesus, and just being introduced to who he was. Um, but also being a little kid, I have memories of the fun parts of it too, and going out for recess, and coming back in and wondering what color the Kool-Aid was going to be that day, and and playing games and songs, lots of songs. Jesus loves me, and Jesus wants me for a sunbeam, and all different kinds of things. So the feeling that I had when I went back to VBS and Emmanuel every year was like walking into a big hug. It was just like walking into a place where you felt welcome, you felt special, you felt like you belonged, you felt like you were involved. And then at the end of the week, there would always be a program, a program in the evening where all the classes would sing, and uh, I can remember in the 4th grade, all we did for the 4th grade program was just recite a psalm where the pastor would say something, and all we had to do was say, "And his mercy endureth forever, and his mercy endureth forever," about 45 times, and that was very easy for us to to have to learn. So there was that, and then at the same time, when I got to elementary school, I had a classmate in school whose father was the pastor of a much smaller church that actually was meeting in a former schoolhouse. And they were, and I got invited by them to come to church. And that was a different experience for a couple of reasons. One was because I was being invited to come to church on Sunday morning, which was a very different experience for a kid than going to, Vacation Bible School. And the story about who Jesus was a little bit different at the second church. It was a it was what we would call in our understanding of the faith, a decision theology kind of church. It was that very straightforward, black and white. There's evil and sin in the world. I can remember in the Sunday school at this church, the teacher using a color wheel where she would expose the color black is the color of your sinful heart, and then she would spin it around. Red is the color of the blood of Jesus. And white is that your sins have been washed away, and now you're pure. And so there was a great emphasis on the very reality of sin, and an emphasis on asking Jesus to come into your heart, to be your personal Lord and Savior, and then you would be okay. You would get to go to the good place instead of the bad place if you did those. Um, and That's pretty heavy stuff for a 7-year-old. For a 7-year-old to have that be their introduction into what faith is like. And I was very precocious. You might be surprised to find out, when I was 7, and I took what I was hearing very, very seriously. And so I came forward for an altar call, and gave my heart to Christ, and did all the things that I was supposed to do. But what I noticed after that was that I still did some bad things sometimes. I was still mean to my sister, and sometimes selfish, and sometimes lots of things that kids do, and that really bothered me. I felt a lot of guilt. And there were youth activities and things that went along with that church too. But the other thing was that grandpa and grandma left completely up to me whether I wanted to go or not on Sunday morning. The phone would ring at 9:15, and it would be, my friend's family who God bless them, were trying to, reach out to a young person, and they would come and pick me up and take me to church. And there were Sundays that I didn't want to go because I was tired, or because I was bored, or because I felt guilty. And so I would say no. I would hear things like, well, you weren't too tired to go with us skating the other night when we went skating. So, there was a lot of guilt, and that too was kind of a heavy thing for a maybe by now 8 or 9 year old to just sort of hear, and remember having parents that just completely left that to me. And so I uh, I want to say that probably, maybe I went to church off and on, at that church until I was probably about maybe 11, maybe like 10 or 11, off and on. And meanwhile, the only time I ever went to Emmanuel was at Vacation Bible School, which was still happening once a summer. We would get the invitation, to go, and I would go, and I was really starting to kind of like, compare these two different, versions of what faith in Christ was like, that I was hearing, and having a hard time kind of like holding them in tension, and also really having no idea that the Wiltses did anything else at that church except VBS. For all I knew, they opened the church, one week in the summertime and then closed it, and everybody went home, and we came back the next year. So I sort of stopped going to the smaller church, and really was just going to VBS for a while. And then I think I was in the eighth grade at Hunt, which was then a junior high school, and I was in a beginning band, and I struck up a conversation with this girl, and we were talking about church, and she asked me what church I went to, and I said, well, Emmanuel, because that was where I went to Vacation Bible School. And she said, well, I go there too. She said, if you go to Emmanuel, how come you're not in catechism class? Well, I didn't know what those words meant. I didn't know what catechism class meant. So all I could think to say back to her was, well, if you go to Emmanuel, how come I've never seen you at Bible school? so um, um, so anyway, from that, I walked across the street one day to visit with the Wiltses, and to find out if they went to that church all the time, and they said that they did. And I said I understood that there's some kind of a class for kids. Yes, and catechism refers to Martin Luther's Small Catechism, and so I was introduced to the idea that rather than it just being this sort of, you can't be sure whether you're in the right place by what you're saying and how sincere you're being and what giving your heart over to Jesus and all that, that there was a place for learning, that you could learn what God wanted you to learn, like in a class, was a very different, and appealing, kind of thing to me. So it happened that the steps that I took to sort of start going to Emmanuel happened to be when they were just getting a new pastor. They got a new pastor the very fall, that I started going to catechism class, and so I think it was on the first year. It was in the evening. It was like Thursday evenings at, I don't know, 6 or 6:30 or something. And so I would have to ride my bike over there. And one of the interesting things about that was there were several kids in my catechism class that I had known from Vacation Bible School, and then a couple of them were my classmates from school. And I really, and I do have to say that, at that time, and this would have been in the early 70s, there still was a lot of academic kind of approach to the catechism and faith. that for junior high kids was a little too academic. It wasn't quite as experiential as it is now, with games and being able to move around. It was like, kind of like being in a class. And so there was a lot of it, that was could be boring. But I found that I had classmates in my catechism class that were just surly and sullen. And I remember talking to this one kid when we were taking a break. I said, "Why are you so different when we're here than you are at school?" And he said, "Well, it's because I don't want to be here." And I said, "Well, then why do you come? Why are you here?" And he said, "Because my mom and dad make me. And you could have knocked me over with a feather." The idea that somehow exploring faith or going through this process or even this class was something that your parents would make you do was so completely foreign to anything that I had experienced. It was just a very, very interesting concept. So anyway, so I was in the catechism class for 2 years, and I very much liked Pastor Kaiser, who was the pastor who had just started there that fall, and so I learned to be an acolyte, and of course the biggest shock was going to church for the first time in a Lutheran church, where the church service. As you know, there's a set order of service called a liturgy, and in the early '70s, we were still using a book from the '50s, and it was, the whole world of worship has changed a lot, even in the last 20 years, let alone in the last 50. But I know that really took some getting used to because a lot of the kid-friendly stuff of what VBS was kind of like missing in the experience of going to church on Sunday mornings. Sunday morning worship wasn't like going to the VBS end of the week, program. But still, so what I would say is that I still learned about sin and repentance, and the place of evil in the world, but I really also learned that I had been made in God's image and that God called me good and loved me, and that in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, he came to redeem me and the world. And so it was just a very different experience of what it meant to live under God's rule and God's reign, and one that that fit me better. And so so in the Lutheran tradition, babies are usually baptized when you're a baby, and then you get confirmed when you're in the eighth or ninth grade. So my other part of the story is it was ninth grade, and we were a few weeks away from confirmation Sunday. And Pastor Kaiser said that we all needed to bring in our baptismal certificates so he could record that and put it on our confirmation certificate. Well, of course, I was carrying around this deep, dark secret, and that was that I had never been baptized. So I kind of hemmed and hawed and put it off and didn't respond. And, the weeks went by, and finally it was like a week and a half before. And, Pastor Kaiser said, kept me afterwards, and he says, "Well, Steve, why haven't you brought your baptismal certificate in?" And finally, I just couldn't hide it anymore. And so I just said, "Well, I've never been baptized." And he said, "What did you say?" I said, "I've never been baptized." So I said, "I've never been baptized." And then, I was like 13 or 14. And so I was, really upset, and I'd spent all the time, studying and everything. And he looked at me and said, "Well, why didn't you just say something?" He said, we'll just pull the baptismal font over. We'll baptize you just before we confirm you on Sunday morning." And I said, "You mean you could do that?" You could do that. And, like, I don't think he really said this, but the force of what he said was, "Well, I'm the pastor. I can do whatever I want," which of course sets this story in a mythical time far away, long ago and far away. So I think it was April 4th, 1971, along with 9 or 10 of my friends. They brought the baptismal font over, and we all lined up to be confirmed. And before we got confirmed, I knelt and I was baptized in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And my biggest memory is that the dry look was in back in the early '70s, and I had floofed my hair just perfectly. And when he poured that water on the one side of my head, it flattened the side of my head, and that was all I could think about. How awful my pictures were going to look because my head was flat on one side. But so I was baptized, and then like a minute and a half later, confirmed. And I had to get a lot older before I realized that the process that I went through of being baptized and then immediately confirmed was really a lot closer what the early church did than what my peers had done. And it's kind of funny because there was a when we studied the catechism, the one of the things that you study is the Apostles' Creed, which is a statement of faith that divides up your belief into three parts of the Trinity: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And in Luther's explanation of the third article of the Creed, the one that begins with the with "I believe in the Holy Spirit," his explanation of that begins with the words, "I believe that I cannot, by my own understanding or effort, believe in my Lord Jesus Christ or come to him." Now that's a pretty amazing statement. Think about that. I believe that I cannot, by my own understanding or effort, believe in my Lord Jesus Christ or come to him. And it makes you think, then why did I just spend 2 years studying? And it's what comes next that's so amazing, because the next sentence after that is, but the Holy Spirit has called me through the gospel, enlightened me with his gifts, and sanctified and kept me in the true faith. And then it goes on to say, in the same way, the same Spirit calls and gathers and enlightens and sanctifies the whole Christian church on earth. This is most certainly true. Um, and I didn't really realize that at the time, but that really, really, really resonated with me. And then later on, as I found myself, being called to the ministry of Word and Sacrament, and was in seminary, and then even once I got out of seminary and got my first call, I really realized that's really foundational for me in my understanding of what it means for me to be a Christian, and a pastor. And I'm thinking about that because yesterday was the day of Pentecost, and so I confirmed my last three ever young people, and I used that. The explanation of the third article of the creed toward the end of my sermon yesterday. So it was kind of like a powerful inclusio to sort of end that experience where I began. So anyway, that's the story.
I appreciate the insight, and fully that's not something that I truly know. And every time you tell it, um, anytime I guess rather you ask somebody to tell their journey to Christ or how'd they get from point A to point B, depending on how many times they've told it, sometimes you get just a little more insight. And there's a lot of that I've never heard. And maybe you have told over the years, just young enough, I just couldn't remember. But it's a beautiful story to see how seed planting and how God was working in your life at such a young age to be able to use people that would impact you for generations to come. And as somebody who stayed in the Lutheran church, certainly looking back, you could see the appreciation for the liturgy and for the process of catechism. And that's something I admire and find so much beauty in. And our bonding, a lot of the stuff that we've talked about when I went to Olivet Nazarene University, a lot of our questions, a lot of or excuse me, a lot of the questions I had for you and a lot of the topics revolved around ministry. And I know this is something that you have shared with me before. In particular, one piece of advice, which I'll talk about in a moment. But if you could, so how does one go from, okay, hey, I got this Christian thing down, I've been confirmed in the Lutheran Church. Um, I'm I'm going to go to college, which we know that you did. But how in the world does Stephen Krebill at that age? How in the world do you get called into ministry? Because that wasn't what you went to college for
Well,
initially.
I've been asking myself that question for about 50 years now. So it is really good. That's an excellent question. So as I look back, if I were going to say a theme sentence to this, is that God shows up in the ways that you least expect, in the ways that you don't always plan, and sometimes over against the things that you plan. So I would say that as a young person, I always thought that I wanted to go to college. I thought that college would be a good thing for me and my sensibility and my sense of preparing me for an adult life. I thought early on that I wanted to be a teacher. I made the mistake that a lot of young people make who like school, who think that means that will make them that liking school yourself will make you a good teacher. But I like the structure of school. I liked the dependability of it. I liked there was just I was one of those people who flourished in an academic environment and in the social environment of school. So I would say that I always knew that I wanted college to be in my future at quite a young age. What my Christian faith would mean as I grew up and how I would live that out, I don't even think I thought about that when I was that young, and I certainly I may have flirted with the idea of in high school of what it would be like to be a pastor, or to serve the church, because we used to take a trip to Wittenberg University, which is our Lutheran college in Springfield, Ohio. And because my pastor from Emmanuel was from Ohio, we would come down, and so I got the first inklings that there was such a thing as a Lutheran college, and even how somebody even became a pastor. But I would say that, like a lot of other people who have some pretty interesting ideas of what they think a pastor is, I probably had embedded in my brain someplace that being a pastor would be like being a priest or a monk. That there was a certain classification of people, and that you had, not that there isn't, but mostly that the classification involved a particular kind of discipline, and maybe not even piety, but maybe personal holiness, and separateness, I didn't think I possessed or ever could possess. We often or would put clergy on a pedestal, or make some assumptions that they must live this perfect life with no doubts and no questions, and just I mean, it's wrongheaded, but more common than you think. So I really, for quite a few years, the issue of how I would live out my Christian faith um, forward into the future, um, wasn't that huge of a thing for me. I want to make sure that you're clear that it doesn't mean that, having gone through the process of being found by Christ, not the other way around. Christ found me. I didn't find him. That I didn't live that out in my values and how I behaved myself at college. And a lot of that too also harkened back to sort of like an unspoken understanding between grandma and all of her kids about what she expected. And she wouldn't have used faith language or religious language or even moralistic language, but I can remember from quite a young age, her talking about us knowing the difference between right and wrong, and how we should treat people. And we didn't get lectures, but I tell the story that when I was a little kid, I learned at a very, very early age that there was nothing that would make your grandmother more kooky or angry, and that is if you were selfish. If you were a selfish person, selfish, self-centered, especially when it had to do with sharing what you had with other people, especially food. So, for instance, one of the fun things I used to do as a kid was go around and pick up pop bottles, because you could get a 2-cent deposit and then run to the corner store and get candy. And you got 10 cents, you could get quite a lot of candy back in the day. And so I'd bring home a sack of candy, and I could sit on the front porch and eat all of it without any problem at all, unless my brother, my sister, a neighbor kid, if anybody came by and said, "Oh, could I have a piece of your candy?" In the household that I grew up with, the only answer to that is, why, yes. Yes, certainly. Here, you can have all the candy and you give the candy away. And if you run out of it, then you go look for some more pop bottles, or you didn't need it. You can probably edit this out later, but part of the story, the mythology of your parents dating before, before they got married, is they started dating while I was in seminary in Columbus. And back then, grandma wasn't buying pop that much because it was expensive. And I came home for some kind of a break or vacation or something from Columbus. And I got home and I went out and bought a 6 pack of Coke or Pepsi or something. And I put it on the floor in the kitchen. And I probably had one. And then I went off to do something else. And your mom and dad had been out on a date. And they came in and, they came out into the kitchen. And they looked down and saw that there was a carton of pop on the floor. And wow, where did that come from? Because they knew grandma didn't buy it. And Scott said, well, Steve must be home. He must be home. So he helped himself to a bottle of pop. And and then your mom said to him, well, you can't drink that. That belongs to your brother. and and the way that Scott, or the way that your mother tells it, is that your dad turned and looked at your mom, and he gave her a look like she had just been speaking Martian to him or something. And he said to her, I don't know how you do things in your home, but here, we don't do that. Everybody gets everything. So that was kind of an interesting thing. But anyway, yeah. I mean, I lived it out that way, but I went to college with the idea that I was going to be, a teacher, and then got certified to be an elementary teacher and that sort of thing. And um, so I graduated in 1978, and it was very, very important to me because I was a college graduate that I get a job. But one of the other challenges for me was that we didn't have a lot of people in our family who had gone to college. We didn't have a lot of, and we didn't have people who were teachers. And in fact, I would say one ongoing theme in my life at very significant points in my life is when I could have benefited from a mentor in the field that I was thinking about, more or less, a mentor who could have sort of walked me through some difficult decisions. I've never had one, never. That isn't to say that God has not put in my path people that God used to point me in the right direction, but it never was in a mentoring situation. So the way that played out is, just to back the story up a little bit, when I was just in high school, Pastor Kaiser, the pastor who had baptized and confirmed me, left Emmanuel and Jackson. He went to Philadelphia for a while, and then in 1978, as I was starting my senior year, he retired and moved to Toledo, and he took, which is in Ohio, and he took a part-time. He had a part-time call at a church in Toledo. So I hadn't seen from him or heard from him since he left when I was a junior in high school. The day after I graduated from Olivet College in Michigan, the real Olivet College in Michigan, the day after I graduated, I moved back to grandma's house in Jackson, and I went back to work for National Bank of Jackson, where I was a summer teller. And when I got home that first day, in the mail there was a letter from Pastor Kaiser, whom I hadn't heard from, and as I said, telling me all of this, what had happened in his life. And he was writing me and telling me that the church that he was working part-time was looking for someone to serve as a Christian education / youth director for the church. And he knew my undergraduate degree was in elementary education. He knew I hadn't had any specific training for serving the church, but he wondered whether that would be something I would be willing to, consider. So I wrote him back and thanked him for writing and everything, and said, no, I'm not, I haven't thought about serving the church. I'm going to be a teacher. I'm going to get a teaching job. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. And that was in May. So I went back to work for the bank. And like I said, I was really, really very anxious to get a job. So I started filling out applications and sending them off, and really wasn't getting any responses. So what I know now, this is what I know now that I didn't know then. If I could go back, as my adult self now, and tell my young college graduate self something, what I would say is something like this: Steve, I know that you want to be out on your own and you want to be an adult and you want to, get a teaching job and get started. That's perfectly understandable. The first thing that you need to know is that school districts don't hire in May. They're still finishing up their own school year, and then they go on summer vacation just like just like the kids do. And so they really don't even start hiring or even thinking about that until the middle of August, till just before they go back to school. So even though you're in a place where you're very anxious and you're sending out these resumes and you're not getting anything, it's not because there's anything wrong with you or your skills or your abilities or your resume. It's that it doesn't work the way that you think it does. You're going to need to wait until August before you start hearing back. And then what I also would have said to my younger self is, and given the fact that there are no fewer than 11 different school districts within easy driving distance of where your mom lives on Wisner Street, there are going to be lots and lots of possibilities. And you may have to do a term sub, maybe like for a semester before you can get a permanent job, because that was what the market was like in 1978. Michael, if there had been somebody to tell me those four simple things, just three or four simple things, my whole life would have turned out differently. But there wasn't anybody there to tell me all of that. And so I I flew out to Phoenix, Arizona, and drove across the desert and interviewed at a school on an Indian reservation. And I was missing some class I needed for the state of Arizona, so that didn't work out. And I flew to Washington, D.C. and interviewed in Prince George's County, Maryland. And the only reason they gave me the time of day there was because their school district was so huge that yeah, come on over. We'll interview you. And we were getting to August. It was we were getting to maybe like the beginning of August, and I was, I wanted to be out on my own, get a job, and so on and so forth. So I thought, I wonder if that position at that church in Toledo is still open. And it's probably not going to be. That was May. They interviewed me in May, and now it's August. So I wrote a letter to Pastor Kaiser, and that's how we did things back then. We wrote letters, and then we put it on a piece of paper and put it in an envelope and then mailed it, because to call somebody, that would be like long distance. So a few days later, I got back the letter, and they had not filled that position. They had not filled it. So it was still open. And so I went down to Toledo, and I really, really agonized it, because my sense of self and worth was tied up in what it meant to now be a college graduate and have a job. And if it was a Christian education position, I wanted it to be something that I could learn or grow into, or that would fit my skills and abilities, and that sort of thing. um, so I interviewed, and I got the job. And it's also amazing, because when I was 22, I looked like I was 12. I weighed maybe a buck 20 soaking wet, and I looked like younger than the kids. And so I moved to Toledo, got an apartment in Toledo and started working, in this, at a church. Now, here is the thing. So there was a senior pastor, and then Pastor Kaiser, who had been the one, that had, gotten me to come there. And I really thought that between the two of them, there would be some sort of like mentoring kind of relationship, and there wasn't. They had their jobs to do, and they came from like my grandparents' generation, where really it was all about you finding your own way. And what I really quickly discovered was the idea of doing something for youth in a church is a very emotional and very high priority. But in a lot of churches, nobody knows what that means. They just know they want to do something for the kids, and they want the kids to have faith. And and we'll get a Christian education. I know it'll be a good idea. Let's get somebody who's only 4 years older than they are, who will be hip and young and lively, all of which I was, and love Jesus and all of that. But as far as the shape of what that job, was going to be, it just sort of wasn't there. So there, there I was again, to just sort of make it up. And some of it, you can figure out from, going on retreats and, and figuring out Bible studies and activities for kids. I started this thing called Weekday Church Club, which was the closest to like starting a school that I could for my elementary kids on Wednesday afternoon. They came and we had like a little class and little recess and singing time and a meal. And so that took off pretty well. And, I did youth work, kind of the best that I could. Um, but this is what that job did is, first of all, it brought me to Ohio, where our particular branch of the Lutheran Church was much bigger than it was in Michigan. So Ohio had two Lutheran colleges, one in Springfield and one in Columbus, and had a seminary, to train pastors, in also in Columbus. And so I sort of got an introduction to the fact that the church was a little bit bigger in Ohio. But one of the most significant things that happened was that at the end of that first year of that Christian education job, the senior pastor, not Pastor Kaiser, but the other one, came into my office one morning, and he didn't come into my office very much or have much hands-on anything to do with what I did. And he had a letter, and he said, I got this in the mail today. He says, we have a summer camp in Mansfield that uses volunteers in the summertime to lead Bible studies and do things. I think you should consider doing this. And he threw it down on my desk. I had never been to a summer camp or a Christian summer camp or any that wasn't part of my childhood experience. But you already know where this goes, because in that summer, then I took the curriculum and the study book that we were supposed to be using, and went down to Camp Moana and was introduced then to Christian camping, in the Lutheran church. And Moana was very big and very huge, but it introduced me to other people my age, some of whom were still in college or just out of college, and many of them were getting ready to study to be pastors, at Trinity Seminary in Columbus. Many of them were young pastors who were the chaplains, while I was what was called a discovery leader. So it's like I got immersed into the first time of a whole group of other young Christians, young pastors, young people, and I discovered a couple things. First of all, they had a lot of fun. And the second thing was, they weren't all serious as a heart attack. And the other thing was, they weren't some kind of like fake pious either. It was just, they were people who loved Jesus and who embodied the love of Jesus in this week, in what they did, with the kids who came to camp. And so that really, that kind of like really changed my outlook, about what it meant, to sort of like, even serve the church. So kind of like in a parallel way to the beginning of the story that I told you about, coming to faith, there was kind of a parallel story that for a couple of years, I kept going back and volunteering at Moana. And after 2 years in that first church job, I got an opportunity to teach in a Lutheran school, an actual Lutheran school. Now, it was a Lutheran Church Missouri Synod school, which is not, my particular brand of Lutheranism, but it was a school, and it was an elementary teaching position. And so it was going to be an opportunity for me to, sort of exercise the skills and the muscles and try out, what I had trained in college to do. So it was just on the same side of town. And so in 1980, I moved from one church, the Christian education and youth job, to an elementary teacher. And I had first grade the first year that I taught, and it nearly killed me. And because, once again, it was a very, very small school, they were only adding like one grade a year. So there was just I had first grade, and then another teacher had second grade. And once again, there was no on-site principal. The school board was all volunteers. The pastor was really very young, but he was busy being a pastor. And so once again, the whole experience of what this meant, and how I was going to live it out, was left up to me to discover on my own. There were no mentor teachers. There was no principal. The story that I told was that they gave me a reading book and a math book, and that's the two books that we had for curriculum. And all of the rest of what you would do first graders I had to figure out on my own. So I did that for 2 years, and during the 2 years I was at that church, I was still volunteering at Moana, and I met there was a young pastor named Dean Stewart who would bring his kids to camp. He was serving in Xenia, Ohio, down near Dayton, and he was a chaplain while I was a discovery leader, which was kind of a Bible teacher. And there was just a lot of time at camp, to pick other people's brains. And so I remember that when the kids were having rest hour, we would sit up on the back porch of the lodge, drinking a Coke, which was this, that was the big privilege you could have as an adult, was to use the Coke machine when the kids couldn't. And we would talk about life. And so I remember it was Dean Stewart was the first person that I said, I'm really thinking about, maybe I might be called to the ministry, called to ordained ministry. And what do you think about that? And he looked at me and said, I think you should try really hard to do something else. And that really hurt. Yes,
Yes,
at least
that's the piece of advice that you've given me
yes,
so many
right,
times.
yes. But you remember, the rest of the story was, he wasn't trying to hurt my feelings.
Right.
But it was a lot of people, and I've encountered a lot of people in my years of ministry, because I've served on our synod's candidacy committee, where people they think that when they come to somebody else and say, I think God is calling me to the ministry, that the only right responsible, yes, certainly, go right ahead. Why would you not? What a pious thing to do. But what Dean said to me was, he said, the reason I think you should try hard to do something else is because there are lots of ways to serve Jesus and live out your baptismal vocation in the world. There are lots of ways to do that besides being a pastor. And he said, and being a pastor isn't for everybody, and it's hard, and you really need to figure out, not just your own internal personal call, but whether that's affirmed by the rest of the church. There's some other things you need to go through by just feeling like you want to serve God. And of course, by golly, he was right. He was right. You need more than just a sincerity and a sense that all you have to do is say that to people. I'm called to do it, and they will say, well, yes, by all means. Now, there are some expressions of Christianity where that's all you have to do to be a pastor. There are some where people just stand up and say, God is calling me to do this, and as long as you can get a congregation to say, okay, yes, we agree, you can do it. And in our expression of the church, there is some version of that, but your call being discerned and held up and sort of figured out belongs to the whole church at every level. It's what you think, it's what your home pastor thinks, people who knew you, a candidacy committee, a seminary faculty, a whole bunch of people who aren't a group of them. They're not a group of just sort of like anonymous them that are out to get you. They are also beloved children of God, who love Jesus and want what's best for the church, and help in that process of discernment. Well, all of which was lost on me, when Dean said that. But he was right. So I went back, and I did another year of teaching, and I moved up from first grade to a third and fourth grade split. I had third and fourth grade together, still figuring out everything, sort of on my own and everything. But I had a very good year. That second year, it was just a much better year, and still something made me think that, okay, even though I'm having a really good year teaching and everything, maybe this isn't what God had in mind. And so in the spring of 1982, I applied at Trinity Seminary, and I was accepted. And then I had to go to meet before a committee in Michigan, because I moved my residency back to Michigan, back to Grandma's house while I was going to seminary. Um, and I was scared to death. I was scared to death. I was sure that I wasn't, pious enough or smart enough or holy enough or anything enough to do that. Um, but I, I started seminary in 1982, and met, you know, dear friends that I still have, all these years later. There were still some connections. Some of those counselors that I had known from Moana also went through, seminary at the same time that I did, and I can remember in my first year standing in Greek 1 class with my friend who's now Pastor Connie Menser. We're all up on writing on the chalkboard, you know, writing blepo, blepes, blepe, blepetel, writing all these, Greek words. And they were renovating the seminary at the time. And so the heating system was kind of on the fritz. So the heat only had two temperatures, on and off, and it would be so hot in the classroom. So while the professor was going around checking everybody at the chalkboard, I would just kind of like step out into the hallway to get just to get some, air. And I remember stepping back in one time and saying to Connie, "Who are we kidding anyway?" I said, "We're never going to get out of here. They're never going to let us be pastors. They're going to find out that we don't know anything about anything." But much to my surprise, it sort of didn't work out that way. So I don't know, how do you want me to go, finish the or stop so you can say some things, or
Oh,
what do you
well,
want to
I
do?
just think from an observation standpoint, it's again, it's amazing to see. It's just that drawing, all right, and that's something that when I was going to college, I was thinking, well, I'll guess I'll just dabble a little bit. I'll take a couple ministry classes here, and I kept one of the things I kept I'm thinking to myself is I don't see myself as a pastor. I see myself more as a teacher. I'd love to teach maybe at a collegiate level because I really started to appreciate theology. Really started to appreciate the instructional side of things. And but I also like speaking. I liked what pastors did. I basically liked all of the pomp and circumstance. And what I've told you is one of the pieces of advice that I had to ask from you early on was like, what in the world do you do with pastoral care? I'm scared to death of having to go visit people in a hospital or perform a funeral or do a wedding. Like that's all the stuff I don't want to do. And I remember expressing this my freshman year, and after all of that, I decided, I'm not like, no, that pastor, it's not for me. I don't have a calling. I have no desire to do that. And I think even if I wanted to be a pastor, it'd be for all the wrong reasons. I'd only want it for the adulation, and I was talking about selfish. Grandma would have been ashamed. Uh, and and it wasn't until later
But
that
everybody, in your defense, everybody goes through that too, and everybody's scared to death about pastoral care stuff too. That's anybody worth their salt is, especially if you haven't yet experienced yourself in any kind of way, any great personal tragedy, or even walking with someone who's been through that. Yeah.
well, I've come to um, recognize more of that, and I remember you were an anchor for me throughout all of that because of just it was the constant reminder of like you're not that you said it much in a much better way than this, but it's kind of like you're not that important. Like that you're going to be the person to get the questions. You're going to be the person to get the request, not because you have the so much insight and wisdom to offer, but it's because you're in the position. You're the one that in a way
Mhm.
is supposed to get that. And you shared with me some advice about the same advice that gentleman had shared with you about, try as hard as you possibly can to do something else. And if you still feel as if the Lord's calling you, you're meant to do it. And now seeing this in this last 9 months, what God's done in my life, those words probably the most impactful thing I've ever heard
Mhm.
because of this journey I've gone on. But it was funny because every single thing that I've tried to do in my church in this very brief first year of ministry that I'm in, I've tried to lessen Michael Krabill's role,
Mhm.
uplift maybe the position and the care and attention, but realize that I'm not that important as a person. I spoke at North Adams Jerome High School yesterday at their baccalaureate. I kept it very
Mhm.
brief, and I joke because no one wants to hear me talk anyway. And I am there. I was asked because there has to be a speaker at a baccalaureate. There's got to be some sort of something to be given, and I try to take advantage of that. And at the back of my head was the advice of my uncle Steve of saying it's not necessarily because you have all of these great things
Mhm.
to offer. It's because you're in that position, and you followed that up with by saying Don't abuse that. Um,
Yeah.
don't make it about yourself, but don't abuse that
Mhm.
privilege. And you always spun it into the fact that it's a privilege. And when you are annoyed, or when you don't want to do it, or you're thinking about what you're going to say or how you're going to do something in the times of
Mhm.
bereavement and sorrow, you said to me, "Well, what are you making it about? You're making it less about the situation and more about yourself." And if that's not the
Mhm.
definition of selfishness, I don't know what is.
Well, and that, and that's good that you sort of learned that, and that's also part of the learning curve of realizing that. And I wouldn't put it saying that, yeah, it isn't about us, but it doesn't mean that what we have isn't of value and worth. It's just that it's like in the beginning, I always thought that the best pastoral skill you had was your warmth and your winsomeness and your sincerity and all, and your wonderful personality, and that the most important thing, and this would have to do in pastoral care situations and certainly in funerals, was my personal connection with being able to give care to somebody and being with them in an appropriate kind of way was not the same thing as having to have a personal history or a strong personal connection in order to effectively proclaim the gospel, because that's what it is that we're called to do. And it doesn't mean that we don't give of ourselves and and be loving and caring, but there are a couple of things as you were saying that came to mind. I was very privileged that the first funeral I ever had as a pastor was a 95-year-old lady in Hillsdale County who had lived a very long and wonderful life and died very peacefully at 95 in a nursing home. But even and with a very non-demanding family, and it was obviously an ideal situation for it being my first funeral. But still, I remember when I sat down at the typewriter, which is what we used back then to type things out. I really had writer's block. I just had mental block. It just, how do you, what, with my limited experience and everything, and I knew I was supposed to proclaim the gospel, but what is this all about? And I sort of came up with this topic sentence, as I was typing this, and I wrote the first sentence, and I said, "We're here today to mourn the death, to celebrate the life, and to proclaim the sure and certain hope of the resurrection to eternal life for the lady's name." And then everything kind of flowed after that and everything. And I would say in the beginning I didn't realize I was doing this, but the next time I had a funeral, I kind of used that same opening line and then said some other things. And then I don't remember how long it was, but I thought, I'm going to make that a signature thing of my preaching at funerals for the rest of my life and the rest of my ministry. When I do a funeral, I'm going to begin it that way. We're here today to mourn the death, to celebrate the life, and to proclaim the sure and certain hope of the resurrection to eternal life for the person's name. And even though the shape of it can change, it gave me the clarity of what I was supposed to be doing. And first of all, especially these days, everybody talks about, this is going to be a celebration of life. Yes, it is going to be a celebration of life, but what it really is going to be is a funeral where the celebration of life is only one of the three things you have to do, because we're going to mourn a death and we're going to hold up the reality of death. We're not going to run from it. We're not going to hide from it. We're not going to pretend like it's not there, because that'll just give it more power. We're going to start by talking about death, but we're not going to end there, and then we'll celebrate the life. And of course, in situations where I've been somebody's pastor for a way long time, or I knew them, or had a personal relationship, I can include that as part of what it means to celebrate their life. But if I didn't know them, then you can still have that be part of it. It can be things that families give you, or you can just hold it up and acknowledge it. And then the third thing is, we're here to proclaim the sure and certain hope of the resurrection, is a reminder to me that that's really the only reason a pastor's at a funeral. That we're not there because we're the best MCs, And you find out that the reason that it's good to know that you're there to do that and to proclaim the gospel is because the culture tells you a lot of stuff. Culture, the funeral home, and people do think that that a pastor is just an accessory that that goes along with doing funerals, rather than somebody who's there to do those three things. And it's very interesting because now, coming to the end of my ministry, and this is really kind of ironic. In the last week, I've had three funerals since last Friday. I had two. I had one last a week ago Friday, one a week ago Saturday, and one this Saturday. All three of them were people that I didn't know, but had, and I've been here 23 years, and they had some peripheral connection to Bethel, maybe way before I even got here. And it was the situation, where the funeral director calls and says, they'd like the pastor of Bethel Lutheran Church, and that used to really offend me. It's like, I'm me. I'm Pastor Krebill. They should ask for me if they want to, have me. And then I realized, no, it really doesn't matter. They're asking for someone to come and proclaim the gospel. And can I do that? Yes, I can. Can I do that with somebody I haven't met or don't know? Yes, I can. I can proclaim the sure and certain hope of the resurrection for anybody. So I just find that really, really very interesting. And I haven't had a call to do those kind of funerals of people who are on the periphery, or used to go to the church 50 years ago. I haven't had any of those in a long time. And now, 10 weeks before the end of my ministry here, I get three of them in a week. So
Yeah, well, I think that is so important for it doesn't even matter what denomination, but to take an approach like that. I mean, that's the gospel message. I mean, if we can't, yes, the time for mourning, Ecclesiastes even tells us about this, a time to mourn, and time to rejoice, and time to live, a time to die. And if we don't properly mourn, we know we've seen devastating effects from that. And if we don't celebrate the fact that, hey, yes, it's a sad thing, but the reason why we're sad is because of all the good. If
mhm,
you'd hate to go to a funeral of a loved one that you just don't miss. I mean, that's kind of like a fear for probably a lot of people. They want to be
mhm,
missed, and then to top it all off, it's like, oh, hey, by the way, this is a sad day,
mhm,
but it's not a bad day. And
mhm,
the reason why we can say that is because of our belief in Jesus and his conquering of the dead, that sister or brother so and so will be
mhm,
made alive and be restored and new. And I don't know if we emphasize the latter point enough. It's part of pretty much every funeral that I've gone to, but when the family is Christian and there's been a lot of connections, I wish there was more emphasis on the celebration of the life and just the reminder that we'll see this person again. And usually it's just said as a platitude amongst the
right.
people, but from a top down approach, it's something I have so much respect for, and I just
Mhm,
admire the words that God gave you that many years ago, Uncle Steve, because that's something I'm going to use
yeah.
when that day comes, because it's like, again, Paul says, if we preach Christ resurrected, but if he's not resurrected, then we are
Mhm.
wasting our lives here.
Well, and hearing you say that, it reminds me that that's the danger of inserting yourself. If you think it has to be your own winsomeness or your own connection or your own knowledge of the person, that can come off as very false and very tinny if you try to, when you didn't have the connection, of saying, we all remember, when Joe did this or that or the other thing, and the people that, at the funeral, no, you don't know the first thing about him. And it's really very interesting. The flip side of this, if it took me a long time to get past the idea that it had to be about my winsomeness and warmness and connection, that being Pastor Crable means that I can go there and preach the gospel. The opposite challenge is when you have family members that, because you're a pastor, want ask you to come and do a relative's funeral, and then they don't get that difference, and you go to proclaim the gospel, and your relatives are shocked, because and dismayed a little bit, and maybe a little disappointed, because they wanted you to be little Steve. They wanted you to or they wanted you to be winsome and warm and tell stories, and all that other kind of stuff. And there is so what's very interesting is that that's a very valid thing. That's what a eulogy is. A eulogy is where you can stand up and say, something, wonderful about the person that, you loved and everything. And, people do that. They give eulogy, but a eulogy is not preaching the gospel. And that's not what it can be part of it, but that's not what you have a pastor to, do. And, even when grandma died, and we were putting the service together, and I remember talking, to your dad and to Aunt Jody about how we were going to, do this. I said, well, how about if you let me, I'll put the funeral together. And it isn't that they pushed back against that. I said, well, we're going to want to, maybe the kids will. And so I said, can you step outside yourself and trust that I know how to, that this is like, I know how to do this job. Yes. I know how to, I can plan who else can you imagine doing mom's funeral? Who else are we going to get? Yes, there will be room for anybody. I'll shape it so that the kids can be readers, how Brian, spoke and all the other kind of stuff. And your dad gave a, very beautiful and, wonderful eulogy. And I remember after, we agreed that, that's how we were going to shape it. And I was sitting down and remembering, as I was sitting down at my computer thinking, oh my goodness, this is my mother. This is my mother. I better come up with some whiz bang, something the likes of which nobody's ever seen in all of recorded history to prove that it was my mother and how much I loved. And there's something. And I sat down at my computer and I wrote, we're here today to mourn the death, to celebrate the life, and to proclaim the sure and certain hope of the resurrection to eternal life for Rosalind Mary de Bruler Krebill. And so, from my own perspective, I did what I needed to do that day. I preached the gospel, and I put in the middle of it some personal reflections. But I remember the experience of our aunts and uncles that day was that they much more resonated with with what your dad said, because it was deeply personal to him. So was what I said, but the whole theological points of mourning the death and proclaiming the sure and certain hope didn't resonate with a lot of people. They just wanted to hear like the personal stuff, which was fine, but that was not all I was there to do, even for grandma, even for my own mom. So I kind of wonder like that when it's been a while since I've been asked to do somebody else's member of the family's funeral, but I often think about that. Well, if I did, what do they want me to be? Is it because at the MC? Do they want me to give a eulogy? When I had the privilege, when Alice Wiltsey, the neighbor across the street, that gave me the invitation, she died 2 years ago, and the family asked me to do a eulogy, and that was wonderful because the pastor that day was the one who preached the gospel, and then I was able to, like a lot of other people, stand up and say the very personal things, that I remembered, which also included, bringing me to Christ and leading me, a particular way. But it was kind of nice to be able to be the one, that could just say, I'm going to leave to the pastor here, to preach the gospel this morning. I'm just going to tell you about this, this special woman and, what she meant for my life. So that's a perfectly valid thing. And I was glad that I got to do it. But, that's not what a pastor's job is at most funerals. So.
Mhm. You almost bring tears to my eyes because of just being able to still proclaim the truth in the midst of grandma's passing. It's funny, Uncle Steve, and for the people that don't know my grandmother that are listening to this, it is something. It's perplexing. It's the mystery of God that you've mentioned it, but from my relationship with grandma, she was never somebody that was religious, didn't very much continued that lack of attention for religion. However, I know that close to a couple weeks before she died, when she went to the hospital for the last time, she told me, that she had made her peace with God, and I knew because I asked her about church. As an inquisitive young man myself, I'd ask like, why doesn't Grandma Rose go to church with my family and I? It's just always a a question, but
Mm.
I'll tell you, she lived out the gospel more than what I see most Christians do because the way she loved her neighbors.
She was
You
very Christ-like, that's for sure.
and seeing how she loves people and was very fair to people and did not discriminate is it was one of the biggest testimonies to me as a kid. And and we're several years, we're almost, I mean, 9 years now from her passing. I miss her more today than I did 3 4 years ago. And one of the beautiful things about that is that there are a lot of um old elderly women in my church down in North Adams, and they remind me a lot of grandma, because not
Mhm.
just because they're really good cooks and bakers, but it's just from that generation of very much kind-hearted. And
Yeah,
I just find myself clinging to them. And
sure.
I was just able to verbalize this with my mother yesterday, of thinking that, like, the reason why I have so much affection for Deb and for Jackie and for Helena and for Janice and for Bonnie, I find myself like I see grandma in them.
Mhm.
And then it came to a realization that I've I've joked that the average age of my congregation's deceased already, because of how old they
Mhm.
all are. And I was
Yeah.
thinking, I don't know how long God will have me at this place, but
Mhm.
it could be very well that I could bury most of these people. And
Sure.
that thought is humbling is not strong enough a word. It's terrifying.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
humiliating in a way. And I'm thinking to myself, like, how in the world did my Uncle Steve do that for his own mother? And
Mhm.
because, like, there's no way I could do that with my parents, and I'd barely be able to do it with these people that I've come to love and only known for a short while.
Mhm.
But then I realize, again,
Mhm.
it's about me. It's about
Mhm.
what I would want. It's like when there's the idea
Mhm.
of Christ is like farther down the list. So I guess my question is, somebody who has that many years of experience, especially when it comes to funerals, is there any room for the self and what you want for preferences and stuff in the planning of a funeral?
I think, certainly and once again, keeping in mind what your um, role is, and that is, you're there to proclaim the gospel, and you're there to facilitate having that happen. And within that, as a pastoral thing, you can, be all kinds of accommodating to what kind of hymns and things and stuff, that people want to do. And certainly funeral home services are very different than ones that you have in the church, because the message, if a funeral is in your church, then really it is, that's grounded in the idea that, you're coming here because this meant something to you, or proclaiming the gospel means something to you. And within that, you have some control over what, hymns and songs and what's appropriate. Although that's a, you'll come up with some real challenges over the years about, what people, wanted, as opposed to what was appropriate. And people, when they're grieving, it's a very vulnerable moment, and you have to, not necessarily tread lightly, but you have to tread carefully, around that, and decide, what you're willing to, let go for the sake of something that will be comforting, and, something that you want. And usually my experience is if I get the last word, that I make sure that whatever other people, that one thing is that if other people are going to talk or do something, I make them go before me, so that the last thing that happens is that they hear me, proclaim the gospel. But when you were mentioning grandma, I was thinking of, there's, the one thing of it is, even though it is terrifying, it is terrifying, especially, from the perspective of, not having had it happen, in a lot of different ways. But Michael, I'll tell you, it's one of the most holy things you can ever have happen. One of the greatest gifts, I think, of my life, and one that I didn't look for, or it just happened, was that I got to be with both of my parents when they died. That was one of it was the most difficult thing I ever had to do in my life. And at the same time, it was one of the holiest moments too. And you balance that by the fact that, as I was sitting there, when Grandma took her last breath, as powerful it was to be able to be there, in that, in present in that moment. It was very important for me that, she wasn't alone. I mean, she wasn't. Nobody is ever alone, but that, that your dad and I got to be there. But then I was also remembering that in the week before she died, when we first knew that things weren't good, and your dad called Aunt Jody and me up to Michigan to be there. I remember I got to the hospital, and there had been they were sure, or was it? Oh, Grandma was telling me the story. She said, "Well, she says when I first got here." She said they sent a chaplain in, and she said, the chaplain said, well, is there anything I can do for you? Do you want me to pray for you or something? That's something, probably didn't say it like that, but that's probably how she recounted it. And she says, no, I told her, no, my preacher's on his way, which meant me, that I was on my way. So when she told me that, I thought, I felt so strangely moved by the fact that she would refer to me that way, that, the chaplain had asked her to pray and all that. And she said her preacher was coming, because it was really very, very clear, in good ways, that to the I always say most of my family has treated my pastor as being this eccentric hobby that I have, while in between my doing the other important things that I do of being their brother and son and uncle, that sort of thing. But so I was so moved by the fact that she had said, no, my preacher's on his way. And I said, in a moment of vulnerability, I said, well, that's nice. I said, would you like me to pray with you, Mom? And she went, well, go ahead. And I said, well, don't do me any favors. I don't have to. I don't need to pray with you if you don't want me to. I just thought it just fine. We're all just fine. I told somebody later, I said, thought I was going to give her a shot or something like that. But anyway, that was just yes. No, I don't have to pray for you. I'm praying for you anyway. I don't have to say anything out loud. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
and that was grandma. That was grandma through and through too. And it's amazing the testimony of certain people who don't go to church who can still carry the cross well. And then for somebody that wasn't, I would say, a confessing Christian, what you would see maybe traditionally from a lot of people every day talking about the good word. She is somebody that I truly believe we will see her again someday at the resurrection of the righteous, and I'll never forget those lessons that she had taught me, and whether it was through her kindness, generosity, or through her discipline too. Couldn't get away with a lot of things with grandma. She was much more generous to us grandchildren though
Yeah.
than her own. Um, but a lot of these things that you're sharing, Uncle Steve, these are experiences. This is wisdom that's been learned over the course of 35 years of doing this tremendous calling. And I don't want the podcast to go any further without just saying thank you personally, not just for our relationship, but thank you for your service to the church as a once congregant for so many long as now pastor. But thank you for somebody who has done that, because it is a arduous journey. It is difficult. Not many people can relate to the fact it was. Well, how can you be so tired? Like, I don't understand how you're so busy. They don't see the physical work. Because they don't
Mhm.
understand the spiritual weight and the heaviness that it brings, because the burden is very unique, and one of the questions I had was when we were doing our pre-show meetings was just like, what are some things that you would pass on? And that's such a cheap and easy question to ask, because I think people have heard just some of your wisdom here, because it's not something you could learn in a textbook. It has to be done through experience. But as you look back over these 35 years of ministry, not just someone such as myself, but other my friends who are newer pastors, what are some of the things that it took you a while to learn, or stuff that you could only learn by just doing it? You just, no matter how much people told you about something, it just was different when you experienced it for the first time.
Mhm. Well, thank you. That's an intriguing question. There are a couple of things that call to mind. One is, because in the expression of the church that I serve in the Lutheran Church, specifically in the ELCA and the LCA before that, which stands for Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and Lutheran Church in America before that. Um, the structure of how you become a pastor is connected to reminders and touch points along the way of what your call is and what it isn't. So on my wall in my office, my ordination certificate highlights the words word and sacraments, that I'm there, that's my call. That's my doesn't put me above anybody else, but that's the thing I'm set apart for, is to be about word and sacrament ministry. And so that there's a lot of other things that I have to be involved in administratively, but really it's to remember the core of what your call is, and that is to proclaim the gospel through word and sacrament, and everything else that you do needs to be filtered through that. um, and the second thing is, when I was a first year seminary student, they did this in our system. You go to school, or a Master of Divinity is a 4-year program. At that time, it went like this: you did 2 years on campus, and then you went out for 1 year as an intern, where you spent one solid year serving in a church in whatever community they sent you to. And then you came back from that year of internship, and you came for your senior year at seminary. And then, and a lot of senior year was taken up with talking about what you learned on internship, and how, and we actually had a class called senior integrative, because it put to integrate what you had learned on internship from what you learned in seminary. So when we met together in small groups, one of the first exercises they did every fall was that the returning interns, who were now seniors, would impart the wisdom that they had learned from a grand total of 1 year of being out in the parish, for us young pups who were just starting in our first year. And I remember there was a young woman, who was in the small group that I was in, and she said something which at the time just seemed the most, sort of like empty, pious, platitudinal kind of thing. And when she was asked what was the most important thing that she thought she would impart to us, she said, "Whatever else you do, love the people. If you don't do that," she said, "all the rest of it, just doesn't matter at all. Whatever else you do, love the people." And like I said, I thought, oh, that's just sounds like a pious platitude and everything. But by golly, it turns out that she was right. Even though she only had learned that from 1 year of being on internship. I would say that really is an important, if the not the most important thing. Even Jesus said, said that. What's the most important commandment? To love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and all your strength, and your neighbor as yourself. And so, the most important thing about being a pastor is not whether you love God or whether you even love Jesus, but you better be able to love God's people, because people are hard to love. People are, it's not easy to love people. And you're one of the people sometimes who it will not be easy to love. And so if you don't remember that, if you don't remember the greatest commandment, that Jesus that gave, to loving God, and loving your neighbor, then you're not going to be able to make it. You're not going to be able to do it. You're not going to be able to last, because it's hard. I'm repeating myself, but loving people is hard. And sometimes you will be one of the people that it's also hard to love. And if you can remember that and still love people anyway, then it becomes one of the most powerful ways of God showing up despite everything that you may plan or not plan or do or not do. It's one of the most powerful things, is to just sort of get out of the way, and see where God will show up if you just try to love God's people.
Hmm. Yeah, well, thank you very much for that. I mean, that's basically First Corinthians 13, and especially as the shepherd of the flock. If you're not exhibiting love, well, how in the world is the church going to learn how to exhibit love to one another too? So thank you very much for that, and really, I guess, um, It's kind of been building to this because now that it's been made public, I'm curious how the reaction's been from your church, from your retirement announcement. I got obviously you sent the official letter out to the family, but what I've known for quite some time, and my family has known. But how has the reception been to that? And then I guess ultimately, what's next for you? What is it? What does the pastor do after 35 years? What's the identity? What are the challenges, and what's the new adventure like? So I guess it's a two-part question here in closing.
Okay. Well, the reaction so far has been pretty minimal. I got a couple of very nice emails and a couple of texts initially in the first day and a half. Um, and I think people sort of knew that it was coming, but when exactly they didn't know. I think in one way it's sort of uh not overshadowed isn't the word, because that makes it sound like a bad thing. It's sort of being put next to the fact that we're getting ready to go back inside for worship after having not done that for over a year. We're still doing worship in the parking lot. We had a confirmation there yesterday. I've got a baptism coming up in a couple of weeks, so there's a lot of excitement about us coming together and getting back inside and what that's going to look like. And our preschool has graduation this week and all that sort of thing. So I think that's weighing mostly on folks' minds, and they know that it isn't until the end of July, because I've sort of made that. As far as what I'll do. Oh, so I'm sure that as we get closer and as we get to that that last Sunday, once we've gotten inside the church, that things will shift to our being able to say goodbye, to one another after 23 years. Um, and in the letter that I sent, I used the image of seasons of my life. That was the thing that I had been thinking about in seasons that I had been called on to care for other people in my life, and those had been from very specific for a specific season of care for someone who either needed to grow up or grow old, and so that was the kind of thing that got me to reflecting about how that now was the season to be able to retire and from this call, and that the season was ripe and it would be good for the congregation too, at this point a good season for them to sort of find out what's next. But to answer your question, apart from um, trying out being a snowbird, which I'm going to do. I'm going to Florida in this next winter for January, February, and March. I'm in a different place each month. I'm not leaving Berea. As I also said to the folks in my retirement letter, it's not for nothing that I have referred to my comfortable suburban home these past 23 years, and it's paid off in about 2 weeks. So I'm planning on staying here, and so I know that I'm going to go, south for one winter just to see what that's like. And I have this image in my head that at least the first winter, the novelty of having, people like you and Nick and Ben and Kristen and friends, that might want to come down and visit for a week, may play itself out, this first winter. But I also need to see what it's going to be like to actually live there and not just be on vacation. So I'm looking, for places that are near churches and, places where I can, find a community of faith. But then, back here in Berea, there are, as things open up after the pandemic, there are volunteer opportunities. There are plenty of opportunities for me to still serve the church as an interim pastor or a supply preacher, which they probably won't ask me to do much in the first year. But after that, if I feel a need to still serve the church in that capacity, I still could. I could go back to being a redcoat at Playhouse Square, be a volunteer usher there. But for a lot of it, Michael, I don't know. The answer to the question is I have no idea. And it's both exhilarating and terrifying when I've told you that I've enjoyed the structure in my life, all the way back from elementary school to being, I like the seasons. There's the seasons of the church year, the seasons of the traditions that we've developed at Bethel over the years. Those have been very much a part of the fabric of my life. And so leaving that all behind is going to be hard. And some of those ministries have come to an end. Camp Moana got sold a couple of years ago. It's being turned into a nature preserve. So we're at a point where a lot of the things that I did at Bethel are coming to a natural end for those seasons. So having had that happen for all these years, what it's going to look like for everything to just be so open ended is, as I said, it's exhilarating and it's terrifying. But I've lived under the truth that if I just got out of the way and wait to see where God will show up, God will, in ways that I don't expect. So I'm looking forward to it.
Well, I am too because I hope to visit, like you said. I hope to be a part of that part of your journey, and there's certainly something I could be praying for, because it's a new thing, and I am very very proud of you. I am very joyful, filled with joy, to see how you have faithfully Uh, executed that calling and done it so very well and faithfully, to your congregations. And it's just really cool also to walk in the footsteps of another Krebill, preaching in Hillsdale County, Michigan, knowing that I'm the second one. I got big shoes to fill, and I'm just so incredibly blessed to have you part of my life. And I know that the Hillsdale community, as well as your congregation, Bethel Lutheran, have been so blessed by your faithfulness and your service to the church. So I truly, the listeners of this podcast, as well as my family and myself, wish you the best, when it comes to your future, and it's going to be great. And what an adventurous time to start something new for you. And I'm with you every step of the way there, Uncle Steve. I hope to be down there in Florida, and hopefully we could take a couple trips together here and there.
Thank you very much for those kind words. I appreciate it.
Yes, you're welcome, Uncle Steve, and thank you so much for your time here on the We Shall Not Sleep podcast. I hope that you take care of yourself, and you'll just have to come back and return to the show at some point. Okay.
We'd be very happy to do that.
All right. Thanks, Uncle Steve. Hope you have a good night.
You too.
Thank you so much to my Uncle Steve for his time, energy, insight, wisdom. Always sense of humor there too. When you have a Krebill, you always have a little bit of goofiness from time to time. I know that if my Uncle Steve listens to this outro, he'll probably text me and say, "Now, young man, I don't know about goofiness," or something. But hey, I got to speak from my experience, and I'm just been so blessed to have him in part of my life over the years. And now that I'm a pastor, it's amazing to see the conversations that we've had, how they have been blessed by God, because it was for future reference, and just be able to glean from my Uncle Steve and his 35 years of experience. I felt it'd be something that you all would like to listen to as well. So thank you so much for listening to this. Thank you for this continued support, really. Just support now and in the future. It just means the world to me. And if you ever want to email the show, offer some advice, or suggest a topic, feel free to email us at wsnspodcast@gmail.com. Thank you guys so much. And may God bless you, and may God keep you.